thank you for coming this evening. This is our first actually public event for the year, actually. So, and we're very happy to have David present for us today. So I'll just a few words about David. Associate Professor Pritchard holds a PhD in ancient history from Macquarie University in Australia and is Associate Professor of Greek History at the University of Queensland, where he has chaired the Department of Classics and Ancient History. He has obtained many research fellowships in Australia, Denmark, France, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and the United States of America. Since 2022, he is a research fellow in the Nantes Institute of Advanced Study in France. He has published extensively, including his book Athenian Democracy at War, published by Cambridge University Press in 2019, Sport, Democracy and War in Classical Athens, also by Cambridge University Press, and Public Spending and Democracy in Classical Athens by University of Texas Press, as well as numerous other publications such as journal articles and book chapters. The list just goes on. Associate Professor Pritchard frequently speaks on the radio and regularly writes for newspapers around the world. He's currently in Athens, and last week he gave talks to the French School in Athens and the University of Piraeus. We are grateful that despite his tight schedule, David accepted our offer to give a talk for the AAIA, and he's here today to present The Children of Athena, the Armed Forces of Democratic Athens. So, thank you, David.
Thank you. Kalisveras, bonsoir, good evening everyone. I sincerely thank my colleague Dr. Lita Georgopoulou-Gregory for her generous introduction. It's great to be here. I'm very happy to be in Athens again after quite a long absence. But I'm delighted to be giving this public lecture at the Australian Archaeological Institute at Athens. The AAIA has been a superb foreign school for Australian historians and archaeologists of Greece for decades now. It has a wonderful staff and an important network of friends or supporters. May the AAIA continue to flourish in the decades ahead. On the eve of the Peloponnesian War, Pericles famously advised the Athenians how they could win. This political leader reassured assemblygoers that they already had the required funds and armed forces for victory. The first corps that Pericles mentioned was the 13,000 Hoplites. The next two were the 1,200 strong Cavalry corps and the 1,600 archers. The last military branch of which Pericles spoke was the navy of 300 triremes. This paper's aim is to go behind Pericles' famous numbers. For each corps that he mentioned, it studies the legal status of corps members and their social background. This paper explores how they were recruited into their corps and subsequently mobilised for campaigns. It establishes each corps' history and specific organisation. By comparing all military branches for the first time, this paper reveals the common practices that the demos, the people, use to manage their armed forces. It concludes by detailing the common assumptions that they brought to this management. The hoplites of classical Athens were divided into 10 taxes, into 10 units. With one taxis for each of the 10 tribes, a unit was often simply called a phulea or tribe. The division of Athenians into tribes was a democratic reform of Cleisthenes. Soon after 506 BC, Cleisthenes divided Attica into 3 regions. In each region, neighbouring demes were grouped together into 10 tritues, 10 thirds. The deme was the word that the ancient Athenians used to describe a village or city suburb. A tribe had one tritus for each of the three regions. The Athenians believed that Cleisthenes had made them stronger militarily. It is likely that a public army of hoplites was another of his institutional reforms. Of course, as you know, the hoplite was a heavily armed soldier who got his name from his shield, which was called a hoplon. Greek hoplites typically fought as part of a coalition army. When they did, those from a polis, those from a city-state formed a distinct contingent. A contingent from classical Athens was divided into phylae, into tribes. In land battles, Athenian hoplites therefore always fought beside fellow tribesmen. In the 480s, the Athenians created a board of 10 taxiarchs to command their hoplite taxes. It was the taxiarchos who subdivided his tribe's hoplites into lokoi, subunits. The number of a tribe's subunits varied in relation to how many hoplites Athenians had put into the field. Athenian hoplites were the first branch of the armed forces that Pericles mentioned in his last pre-war speech. That I'm speaking, of course, of the famous chapter of Thucydides, Book 2, chapter 13, and you have the relevant verses here. The 13,000 of them who were liable for active service were the largest corps after the Navy. Pericles distinguished them from, quote, from both the oldest, hoi pres rutatoi, and the youngest, hoi ne ortatoi, and all the medics who were hoplites, unquote. The second group of hoplites normally manned only the city walls and Atticus forts. Hermann Hansen's pioneering work on ancient Greek demography establishes that there were 60,000 adult male citizens in 432-431. Certainly the youngest were the precursors of the 4th century of Thebes, that is, the heavily armed soldiers in training who were 18 and 19 years old. The oldest were probably 50 to 59 years of age. In the table of age distribution that Hansen uses, those aged between 20 and 49 years represented 72.7% of adult males. In 432-431, the number of Athenians in this age band was 43,620, and I've rounded up to the whole person here to avoid confusion. The 13,000 active service hoplites therefore represented 29.8% of them. This 30% came from relatively prosperous families. Athens probably began to pay hoplites at the same time as it did sailors in the 470s. By 433-432, the regular misthos, the regular pay for both, was 1 drachma per day. Nevertheless, each hoplites had to purchase his own equipment. This was not cheap because a shield and a spear cost up to 30 drachmas and bronze armour up to 100 drachmas. His ownership of a slave is further evidence of his prosperity. Thucydides believed that every Athenian hoplite brought along a personal slave. The Athenians judged it unsafe to arm slaves for land battles, and so used them only as baggage carriers. In classical Athens, it cost about 200 drachmas on average to buy a slave. Even for a skilled labourer who earned 1 drachma per day, this was expensive. Unsurprisingly, many poor citizens did not own a slave. The old German argument was that the telos, the income class of an Athenian, dictated the military branch in which he served. In the 570s, Solon, the Athenian law reformer, had divided the Athenians into 4 such telea, or income classes. Service as a hoplite, it was argued, was a legal requirement of every member of his third lowest telos. This class, called Zergitai, yokemen, produced at least 200 medimnoi of agricultural produce. The top 2 telei were the 500 medimnoi men and the hippais, the horsemen. It was long argued that they had to serve as respectively ship captains and horsemen. Members of the lowest income class, who were called thetes, hired labourers, were free to volunteer to be sailors or archers, according to this old German argument. In the last 20 years, the study of ancient Greek agriculture has refuted this old argument. Hans van Vies puts beyond doubt that an individual Zergites needed at least 8.7 hectares in order to qualify for his telos. Because Attica had only 96,000 hectares of arable land, there was simply not enough for all 13,000 active service hoplites to be Zergitai. When Van Vies factors in the land that the other income classes owned, it emerges that the top 3 telea provided only 1/2 of the hoplites. On the eve of the Peloponnesian War, the other half were thetes. Telos membership, it appears, played no role in the recruitment of hoplites. Instead, a non-elite Athenian probably simply chose whether he would be a hoplite, an archer, or a sailor when, as an 18-year-old, he was registered as a citizen in his deme. If he decided to be a hoplite, this choice was written beside his name in the register that a demarch maintained of adult Athenians in his deme. Of course, a demarch was the official magistrate or mayor of a village or suburb in ancient Attica. Before a campaign, each taxiarch drew up the catalogos, the conscription list of his tribe. He got the names of conscripts by asking the demarchs in his tribe to nominate them. Commanders were not supposed to conscript hoplites who had recently served. Each tribe's conscription list was displayed under the statue of its eponymous hero in Athens' Agora, in Athens' civic centre. The statues of the tribal demigods here formed a monument that served as the democracy's notice board. On display too was the date when the conscripts had to muster and where they had to do so. Most often, they mustered in the athletics field of the Lyceum, which was just outside the city walls. But musters could also be held in, for example, the Agora itself, or the meeting place of the Democratic Assembly on the hill of the Penis. In the last 2 locations, horoi, boundary markers have been found. Their inscriptions state that a tritus, a third of a tribe ends, and another third of the same tribe or the next tribe begins. These horoi presumably help the taxiarch to call the roll of his tribe. The second corps that Pericles mentioned in his last assembly speech before the Peloponnesian War was the cavalry. In 432-431, it consisted of 1,000 hippais, 1,000 horsemen, and 200 hippotoxotai, 200 mounted archers. The horsemen, who were always Athenian citizens, were likewise divided into 10 tribal units. Each phulea of 100 horsemen was commanded by a full lakos, a phylarch. 2 hipparchs commanded the corps as a whole. Hippaes were conscripted for a campaign in the same way as hoplites. Their names were placed on a tribal catalogos, a tribal conscription list. When he compiled a conscription list, however, a phylarch had access to what a taxiarch never did, a central record of horsemen. Athenian democracy simply did not have enough secretaries to maintain a central record of 13,000 hoplites, but could do so for the cavalry corps because of its much smaller size. The cavalry corps was most probably created in the 450s. Initially, it had only 3 units of 100 horsemen each. The famous temple for Athena, the Parthenon, which was completed by 438-437, gives a firm date by which the cavalry corps had been expanded to 10 units. This branch participated in the Pompeia procession of the Great Panathenaea, which was the focus of this temple's north and south friezes. The Parthenon's south frieze most clearly depicts 10 distinct units of hippaes, which have slightly different uniforms. This is surely a depiction of the 10 tribes of the expanded cavalry corps. Serving as a horseman was much more demanding than being a hoplite. Each horseman had to buy his own war horse and a horse for his slave groom. The 2 horses probably cost him 500 drachmas. His service was also a full-time commitment because horsemen had constantly to train and always to be ready for immediate deployment. This training took place in or around the urban centre. Corps members regularly paraded in the agora, or for example, in one or another of the athletics fields outside the city walls. In order to find enough recruits for their expanded corps, the demos decided to give them 2 financial subsidies. The first was a setting up loan so that a recruit could buy his war horse. The second was a misthos of 2 drachmas per day year-round. Because a horseman needed only 1 drachma for the fodder for the food of his horses, he could take home the same amount as a hoplite. Solon's income classes played no role in the recruitment of horsemen. This explains why hippaes in our sources are members of either his second highest income class or the cavalry corps. The term was never used simultaneously to describe both groups. Instead, serving as a horseman was a legal requirement of, to quote Xenophon in this work, quote, those who were most able in terms of money and physical capacity, unquote. Indeed, hipparchs could compel 20-year-olds who met these criteria to join up. There was a very good reason for the first criterion. The 500 drachmas that a horseman had to spend on his horses was at least 5 times more than what a hoplite paid for his equipment. This was the equivalent of 2 years of wages for a skilled labourer. While the state lent him the money for his own horse, he had to pay this loan back after 10 to 15 years, when he retired from the cavalry corps. This would have been daunting to everyone except those who knew that they would inherit enough to cover a setting up loan. Therefore, it is unsurprisingly, that Aristophanes, the famous comic poet, in this famous comedy of his, believed that all 1,000 Hippites, rather, belonged to the elite. Demographic modelling seems to confirm Aristophanes' belief. Horsemen were aged between 20 and 32.5 years. In the age distribution table that Hansen uses, they account for 37.2%. In 432, 431, there were, in this age band, 22,320, of which the 1,000 horsemen were 4.5%. This is slightly less than the 5% of Athenians who were wealthy. Simply belonging to the elite made a physically fit young Athenian liable for cavalry service. The horses that the 200 mounted archers rode were owned by the state. After 412, 411, when the demos began to reduce pay for the cavalry corps, the Hippotoxotai always earned twice as much as the 1,000 horsemen. This heavier subsidisation suggests that the mounted archers were much less able to bear the cost of corps membership. It strengthens the case that they did not belong to the elite. Athenians certainly served as Hippotoxotai. Nevertheless, they did not serve beside the Hippites in the 10 tribes. Rather, they formed their own unit under the direct command of a hipparch. We last hear of mounted archers in the 380s. In 432, 431, the third corps that Pericles mentioned were the 1,600 archers. The Athenians had no toxotai, no archers at the Battle of Marathon in 490, 489, because 10 years later they could put such soldiers on their triremes at Salamis. This corps must have been created in the 480s. In 483, 482, Themistocles, a famous political leader, convinced the Athenians massively to expand their public navy. The 200 triremes that they had after this shipbuilding was Greece's largest public navy. Archers had a great deal to contribute on their decks. They could kill enemy rowers from a distance and help to stop any hostile boarding of their triremes. The demos probably saw archers as a good way to increase the military advantages that they sought from a much bigger navy. Therefore, it is likely that they decided to create the archer corps as part of their naval expansion in the late 480s. The Athenians in this branch were undoubtedly Thetes because, as we will see, they had joined up as a way of escaping dire poverty. Nevertheless, there is no evidence that their membership of this income class had made them liable for archer service. Toxotai presumably joined the corps on a voluntary basis as hoplites did theirs. The demos also created a board of toxarchoi, or archer corps commanders. Their branch's small size allowed these commanders to maintain a central record of members. Toxarchoi were required to draw up a catalogos of conscripts for each land or naval campaign. Therefore, conscription was common across the terrestrial branches of the Athenian armed forces. In other respects, however, the archer corps was differently organised. Many corps members were actually metics, because membership of a Cleisthenic tribe in classical Athens was a prerogative of Athenian citizenship. the inclusion of such resident aliens ruled out the corps' organisation by tribes. Indeed, it is not clear that archers even had regular units. The demos may have understood the military advantages that their archer corps gave them, but they still held archers in low regard. The Athenians believed that a brave man bore kindunoi, dangers in spite of the personal risk. In bearing them, he accepted the possibility of death in battle. In land battles, by contrast, archers ran away when the other side got too close. Because they could shoot their arrows from a safe distance, they bore much lower personal risks. This meant that archers appeared not to meet the popular definition of aletheia, courage. Playwrights and public speakers did not fail to point this out. Therefore, the first reason why the demos held archers in such low regard was that they judged them to be cowards. The second reason is that they saw archery as a predominantly barbarian mode of combat. In fact, many, or possibly even most, of the resident aliens in the archer corps were such non-Greeks. Athens also had a police force of 300 barbarians. These demosioi, these public slaves, were armed as archers. In the eyes of the demos, the main combat mode of the despised Persians was, of course, also archery. The New Zealand scholar, the late Matthew Trundle, rightly asked why some Athenians chose to be archers in spite of this low regard. The demos considered archers to be the poorest branch of the army. It is possible that what attracted citizens to it was state pay and the fact that it cost less than hoplite service. But the same was the case with the navy. In addition, the demos held sailors in much higher regard, seeing them as no less courageous than hoplites. Yet, the archer corps offered much better employment conditions. Athens required toxotai to be ready for immediate deployment and always to be practicing their perishable skill. To meet comparable requirements, horsemen were employed on a full-time basis. There is good evidence that archers enjoyed the same conditions. Sailors, by contrast, earned pay only for their days on the high sea. Here is the answer to Trundle's good question. Some poor Athenians chose to be archers because they needed full-time employment. Yet offering such steady jobs did not come cheaply. In 432-431, archers also earned 1 drachma per day. Consequently, their misthos used up 10% of the state's annual budget, a fact that is remarkable in itself. After the Peloponnesian War, Athens found it immensely difficult to pay for such recurring costs. By the time of the Corinthian War, budget problems had forced the Athenians to disband their archer corps. The last military branch that Pericles mentioned in his pre-war speech were the 300 triremes. It was the duty of all citizens to fight for the state. In 432-431, 2/3 of them met this duty by serving in the navy. The 200-strong crew of a standard Athenian trireme were divided into 4 groups. 2 groups were the 4 toxotai and the 10 epibatai. The third group consisted of the 6 petty officers, a very old-fashioned English term. These officers were called collectively per huperesia, the assistants, because they assisted the ship captain. The fourth group were the 170 nautai. The trireme got its name from the three levels of the benches on which these rowers sat. The demos judged that those who sat on the top bench contributed the most. No doubt you'll like to know that a trireme had 62 top bench, 54 middle bench, and 54 lower bench rowers. A trireme crew was led by a triarchos, a triarch. What differentiated this ship command from other forms of military service was the huge cost. The state left the recruitment of nautai to individual triarchs, while it paid the misthos of sailors. Triarchoi that wanted the best of them paid more than this wage. At sea, triarchs also paid for ship repairs and replacement rowers. The average recorded cost of a triarchy, and it's good you're sitting down, was 4,436 drachmas. Therefore, it is easy to understand why the demos made the triarchy one of the two liturgies or public services that the wealthy were legally required to perform. Each year, the generals drew up a list of those who might be conscripted for the triarchy. He who was conscripted was exempted from being so again for 2 years. This meant that the wealthy met their military duty by alternately serving in the land army and the navy. In order to keep track of his expenses, a triarch always maintained a detailed crew list. In 405-404, the demos honoured the sailors of their 8 triremes that escaped from the final military debacle of the Peloponnesian War at Cavalry. So this is an extraordinary monument. This was a monument honouring the crews of 8 triremes that escaped from the final battle of the Peloponnesian War, and these sailors participated in Athens' last stand before the Spartan siege descended on the city. The demos honoured them by setting up a monument with their crew lists. What survives of this stela provides the crew lists of 4 of these warships. Epibatai were regular members of the Hoplite Corps who were serving in a fleet. While these Marines were usually volunteers, there still needed to be a roll call in order to ensure that all had kept their promise to serve. For the sake of this call, the Athenians installed the same horoi in the naval harbour of Zia, as they had in the other muster grounds for hoplites, namely tritus markers, third markers. If Marines also embarked third by third on a single trireme, they should have come only from 1 fulea or 2 fulai in the official order of the tribes. IG 131032, the famous naval catalogue from 405, recorded the dean names of citizen sailors. Because the citizen's dean determined his tribe, it lets us test this hypothesis. On each of the stella's triremes, the Marines were scattered right across the 10 tribes. They clearly had not embarked by tribes. The employment of resident aliens in the Archer Corps simply ruled out the use of tribes for embarking the conscripted archers. The most important petty officer on a trireme was the kubernetes, the helmsman. He controlled the steering oars, and so with the help of the proirates, the bow officer, navigated the trireme. These 2 petty officers had 5 deckhands each. The orders of the kubernetes were relayed to the rowers by the kalostes, the rowing master, who along with the alotes, the aulos or flute player, set the rowing speed. The final 2 petty officers were the naupegos, the shipwright or naval engineer, and the petekontakos, the purser, the money man on board. Without per huperesia, a trireme could not function. The classical Athenians therefore preferred to reserve these indispensable military roles for fellow citizens. Their mobilisation had 2 stages. In the first, the state conscripted the required number of petty officers. The second stage saw the triarchs compete with each other to hire the best of these conscripts by offering bonuses. Because this second stage ruled out any role for the Cleisthenic tribes, it is unsurprising that each huperesia on IG 1032 came from non-contiguous tribes. Rowers were never formally recruited into the armed forces. Rather, they simply turned up in the Piraeus when a fleet was just about to depart. Triarchs competed with each other to hire the best of these volunteers. Most of the Nautai whom they hired were fellow Athenians. Indeed, from 433 to 426 BC, there were normally 50% more Athenians in this branch of the armed forces than were required for the fleets of any particular year. In spite of this, a triarch always had to hire non-citizens in order to find his 170 rowers. Most of these rowers were medics, but others were simply non-resident foreigners from the hundreds of Greek city-states in the Athenian Empire. While the Athenians never used slaves in land battles, they found that giving them an oar was safe. Therefore, triarchs also regularly employed slave rowers. Since these commanders relied on non-citizen rowers, many Athenian nautai clearly did not row every year. This suggests that their service pattern was similar to hoplites and triarchs. After serving in a fleet, they had a rest for a year or more. The use of the market to mobilise rowers and the non-citizen status of many of them ruled out tribal organisation. On each of the triremes of IG 131032, there were quote-unquote citizen rowers from almost every Cleisthenic tribe. The conclusion. Very little remains of the old argument about Solon's income classes. They played no regular roles in the Athenian armed forces. Instead, it was compulsory for every citizen to serve in one branch or another. His income class had no bearing on this. The demos saw such service as a core duty of citizenship. The rich, as well as the poor, were under peer pressure to perform it. Individuals personally censured those who were shirking this military duty. Fighting as a hoplite or a sailor was one of the few opportunities that the poor had for acquiring social esteem. Consequently, the pressure on them to serve was greater still. Apparently, it was enough to motivate those who were reluctant to do so. For the state never used a law court to force non-elite Athenians to join one or other branch of the armed forces. Telos membership did not determine either the branch of the armed forces. in which a citizen served. For the poor, this was a personal choice. Their sons could choose which corps suited their circumstances the best. In so choosing, they knew that sailors were esteemed as highly as hoplites, and that every military branch earned methos. The less prosperous among them chose the navy, because serving in it was cheaper than serving in the hoplite corps. But it was also less convenient, for while most Athenians lived in the countryside, recruiting for a fleet occurred in the urban centre. Athenian fleets were often away during the busiest months for farmers. Hoplites, by contrast, were recruited in their ancestral demes for land campaigns, which often took place during the farming year's quietest months. Consequently, farmers especially encouraged their sons to be hoplites. Nonetheless, this choice was available only to the more prosperous, because a hoplite was expected to bring his own slave, and his equipment cost considerably more than a sailor's. While the demos held archers in much lower esteem, the state paid them on a full-time basis. This made the archer corps the best choice for those less prosperous Athenians who had to be certain that their military service would double up as a livelihood, as a job. The wealthy did not enjoy the same freedom of choice as the poor. Their telos, though may not have determined their core, but their membership of the elite certainly did. In the 480s, the demos massively expanded and upgraded the state's navy, so that there would be enough triarchs. They made commanding a warship one of the liturgies the wealthy had to perform. Triarchs who refused to serve faced the full force of the law. 40 years later, the demos quadrupled the cavalry corps. To find the extra recruits, they made serving as a hippais compulsory for the Athenian elites' young men. Although they now financially subsidised corps membership, again another startling fact in itself, it still remained unaffordable to the poor. If a young man could not be persuaded voluntarily to join the cavalry, a law court could make him. Conscripting Athenians for a campaign was common right across the armed forces. This practice was simply never confined to Solon's top 3 income classes. Because about half of Athenian hoplites came from his 4th income class, their conscription lists always included fetes. The state also used talogoi to conscript archers and the Navy's petty officers. It is true that Athenian rowers who clearly were thetes normally volunteered to go on a campaign. Nevertheless, there was no legal barrier to conscripting them. In the 5th century, for example, they were so recruited on the 3 occasions when the Athenian state had to resort to conscription to man a fleet. An expectation that was common to different corps was periodic service, and that is a very important finding for our understanding of Athenian success at war. Although the demos strongly held that an Athenian was duty-bound to fight for the state, it was generally not expected to perform this duty all the time. It was enough for him to fight periodically. This popular expectation was built into the conscription of hoplites. The generals were required by law to ensure that this corps' conscription lists did not include those who had recently served. Wealthy Athenians were also expected only to be triarchs periodically. Normally, Athens had many more Athenian nautae than the total number of rowers that it needed for a fleet. The fact that triarchs habitually hired non-citizens as well as citizens shows that a lot of these Athenians did not feel obliged to row every year. Record keeping was also a common practice in the armed forces. For every corps, the Athenians created written records of those members who were serving on a campaign. The generals left it to each taxiarch to complete the list of hoplite conscripts from his full air. He was unable to consult a central record of corps members, as a sheer number rendered impossible the upkeep of such a central record. After compiling his conscription list, a taxiarch displayed it in the civic centre. As each group numbered far fewer, the state could maintain central records of horsemen, archers, and petty officers, as each group numbered far fewer than the hoplites. In the land army, corps or unit commanders compile these conscription lists for a campaign. By contrast, in the navy, record keeping was generally left to ship commanders. The organisation of the armed forces by tribes was much less common. Those corps that had non-Athenians as members could not be so organised, since tribal membership was a prerogative of citizens. This was not an issue for an Athenian hoplite. His name's inclusion, his tribe's katalogos, signalled his conscription. At the muster, he stood behind a tribal subdivision so that the commander of his tribal unit could conduct the roll call. A hoplite from Athens always fought next to fellow tribesmen in land battles. Certainly, the expanded cavalry corps was, except in the mounted archers, also organised by tribes. The archer corps' inclusion of medics ruled out the same organisation by tribes. In the navy, most nautae normally were Athenian. Nevertheless, individual triarchs still hired as rowers medics and non-resident foreigners. Another point on which the navy differed from the army was that they also hired slaves. Because Athenian rowers served alongside such non-citizens, the use of the Hellenic tribes for organising them was simply not possible. Thank you very much.